insights into, and that is, of course, Bryony, who is how old? 13, right? So we see that she's fairly childish, but she is starting to be interested in adult things. And her sister, Cecilia, who is 10 years older than her, right? And so we've seen how, and we've talked about how each of these chapters that we read so far has been, even though it's told from a third-person perspective, right? So with a narrator who is outside of the story, but who is able to see into the minds of, and the thoughts and the ideas and the motivations of the characters that are presented to us, right? But nonetheless, that each chapter has taken the perspective of one of those characters, right? So chapter 1 focused upon Bryony and her thoughts about the play and her twins coming and the divorce and all that sort of stuff. Chapter 2 focused on Cecilia and her thoughts about having finished university, preparing the wildflowers, the scene at the fountain, right? All those sorts of things. And we saw that that continues, right? So for today's reading, chapters 6, 7, and 8, right? We're introduced to some new perspectives, right? So whereas we've mostly seen Bryony and Cecilia, and then towards the end of the final chapter that we looked at last time, we saw a little bit focus upon Lola and Paul Marshall, but mostly upon Bryony and Cecilia, right? This time, chapter 6, chapter 7, and chapter 8, we have new perspectives, don't we? Right? Well, not so much chapter 7, but 6 and 8. Chapter 6, which character does that focus? Emily Tallis, and what is her role in the story? What is her relation to the other characters? She's the mother of Bryony and Cecilia, right? And of course, Leon as well. Okay. Chapter 7 switches our attention back to who? Back to Bryony, right? And we see that she's all upset, right? Her play didn't work out, and so she goes out and she slashes at nettles, which if you don't know what nettles are, they're a kind of weed that if you touch them, they sting a lot, right? So she gets a stick and she's smashing at the nettles and being very mad, right? And rethinking all of her ideas about plays and saying, oh, plays are stupid, right? Plays are for children, and plays are for, I don't want to write plays anymore. I want to write novels, right? I'm an adult, right? While having a childish tantrum about it. And then chapter 8, to Robbie, right? So this is, even though we've already been introduced to Robbie as a character, this is the first time we really kind of get inside of his thoughts, right? And we see him thinking about what kind of things? What is he thinking about? Right? First of all, he's thinking about Cecilia and the scene at the fountain, right? And he's starting to realize, oh, maybe I have feelings for this woman, right? So that's one thing. What else is he thinking about? His future, right? So we've seen already that both Cecilia and Robbie were at the same time studying at Cambridge, right? Although from what we can tell from the story, she kind of avoided him during their time at Cambridge. So those 3 years studying there. And what was he studying? English literature, yeah. Good subject, right? Except, what has he decided to do with his life? Yeah, he could go on and study more, right? He thinks, well, I got a first, which is the highest grade. I could go on and study more, but he decides, no, it would be more useful with my life to become a doctor. There's one other thing that he thinks about becoming at some stage from his reading. A gardener, yeah, right? Because he's so impressed by the 18th century poetry that he read. He's like, oh, wow, I love this poetry, I love this style, I love the ideas. I'm almost tempted to become a gardener, but no, ultimately he wants to be a doctor, and he has these imagine visions of himself 20 years in the future when he'll be an eminent doctor, everyone will respect him, he'll be very successful, and this is what his life will be like. All right? So these are, again, as I said, these are the different perspectives, the way in which perspective is used in the novel. Right, now, before we examine that idea of perspective a little bit further, I want to come back to an idea that some of you, by the questions that I got after class, were a little bit confused about, right? And so I want to go over it again from a slightly different angle. And that was the example that I gave of the wildflowers, right? Remember, we have Cecilia takes some wildflowers and she wants to arrange them nicely in the expensive vase or the precious vase that her family has. This leads to the fountain scene, so it's quite important, right? And remember, what she's trying to do with wildflowers is that she's trying to put them into the vase in a way that looks like they've just fallen in there, right? They haven't been arranged, right? Has she arranged them? Yes, right? But she wants to make it look like they haven't been arranged. Okay, she wants it to look natural, right? Now, this is one thing that McEwan, throughout the story, especially with regard to the nature of novels, right? Is this a true story? Did this story of Bryony and her family and et cetera, did it really happen? No. Could it have happened? Right? It's possible, right? Because the descriptions that we're given are realistic, aren't they? Right? So we see that there are historical details, there are psychological details, physical details that are all real, right? And that's why this mode of writing that McEwan is using is known as realism, right? And particularly, remember when we had that flash forward that we were told, in which we're told about Bryony's future as a writer, we're told that after trying all sorts of different styles, she settles upon psychological realism, which means focusing in particular upon creating characters that think in a realistic way, right? And creating really good characters that have depth and that have, a real kind of, the psychology is realistic. So let's take a look, for example, at a picture I put up last time. And we're told at the beginning of one of our chapters today, I think it's chapter 7, the one focused upon Bryony. A few more details about that, the island temple, right, that the Taluses have on their land. Right? And remember I said to you, it's meant to be something very similar to this. This design here, right, by Nicholas Rivette, right, the painting is by Thomas Daniel, but this actual design of this temple is by Nicholas Rivette, right? And this is the design that McEwan has in mind, right, when he's talking about this island temple that the Taluses have on their land. Tell me, does this look natural? Does this look like a natural scene? Does this look like it's in the wild? Does it look like a city? No. It doesn't look like a city. It doesn't look urban, right? It doesn't look like it's going to be like, there's a factory around the corner or there's going to be a bank or anything like that, right? Or like industrial sort of housing, right? This is countryside, but what's not natural about it? Apart from the fact there's a building there, but even if we put aside the building, what seems to you unnatural about it? Okay, there's a bridge there as well. If we don't take into account the human-made buildings, is there anything about this that seems unnatural? Because I'll tell you, one of the ideals that the neoclassicists had as creating this kind of garden was, right, is that you created a garden that on the one hand was kind of used natural things like trees and flowers and so on, but at the same time, you didn't just allow those trees and flowers and all those sorts of things just to grow anywhere, right? The idea was that you arranged them in a particular order, right, in order to create this effect of having a sort of a rational order to your garden that is nonetheless natural, right? So it's meant to give this impression of, oh, we're in nature. Look, there's trees. Look, there's flowers, right? But at the same time, this is not really nature, is it? Right? It's a garden, right? It's constructed. It's artificial, ultimately. Okay? So when we come back to look again at those questions that I put on the previous slide, what do we mean by the natural then? Right? And this is not a question that we can easily answer, right? This is not something I say, oh, all right, all of you, tell me now what the natural is. Right? It's something that is a complicated idea that, as McEwen is getting us to think about here, is something that we often take for granted. Right? Something that looks natural or that we have been used to thinking of as natural. Right? So when we go to, when we go to a big garden like a botanical garden type place, right? We tend to go there and we tend to think of these as being samples of the natural. But again, a garden is organized in a particular way, right? It has a particular order to it that is also artificial even though it contains natural elements, right? So I want you to think of this again, not just with regard to things like gardens, plants, trees, and nature, but also think of this with regard to our text itself, right? There are things about a novel that in a sense are, or this story, that in a sense are real, natural, ordinary, right? The way the characters behave, the way they think, who they are, they all come across to us as, yes, I could imagine these people really existing. At the same time, they're artificial, aren't they? There is no real character called Bryony. Right? These characters, these scenarios, these situations didn't actually exist as specific characters and scenarios. Right? So one of the things that can be tricky about reading a novel is that we start to get used to the conventions of what a story does. We start to get used to thinking, oh, okay, our narrator can just see into the thoughts of other people. Our narrator can describe something that's happening on the other side of the world. Our narrator can, see things that they normally would not be able to see, right? And we say, oh, well, that's just normal. That's natural. Happens all the time in novels, right? But it's really, again, like a garden, it's something that uses natural things, uses things that appear to be natural, appear to be normal, but actually are artificial, that are actually constructed, right? So that example of the wildflowers with Cecilia, that's why I was pointing out that last time as something quite important, because in that example, remember, she takes something that is meant to be natural. Wildflowers are something, they're not something that are cultivated by, they're not cultivated in a garden, right? You have to pick wildflowers in the wild. That's why they're called wildflowers, right? So there's something that actually is natural. And we see Cecilia trying to arrange them in a way that looks natural to her, which is disordered, right? Not constructed, so that when she expects Paul Marshall to look at the flowers, say, oh, these look like they've just been sort of thrown in there, right? Even though she's carefully ordering the vase to make it look like they've just been thrown in there. She keeps getting annoyed. No, they look too neat. They look too tidy, right? So McEwen here is getting us to think about What is the natural? What is something constructed? And if we have to think about whether it's constructed, whether it's artificial, right, then it probably is, right? So this is one of the major criticisms that both the modernists and the postmodernists, like the 20th and 21st century writers, have tended to make of romanticism, right? Romanticism tended to idealize what nature was. Tended to say, oh, nature was, beautiful, or nature was a certain way and it had a certain conception of what the natural is. But its idea of nature was not really what nature was. It was a construct. It was artificial, right? So let me just give one last example of how complex this idea is. If I say to Nam He, act naturally, right? And then Nam He starts thinking, oh, what does it mean when I act naturally? Do I do this? Do I look up? Do I look down? And then that means you stop acting actually naturally when you try to think about what it is to be natural, right? You start to look for the constructs, the artificial ways in which you can be natural, and you stop actually being natural, okay? So this is a complicated idea, but ultimately it is McEwan getting us to, in particular, think about the nature of a novel, right? It has real things in it, has real elements, it has historical things, it has real ways of thinking, like the characters actually really do think like this. These are very human kind of characters. They do behave this way. There are historical events that happen in here that are real, but at the same time, this whole thing is ultimately artificial. It's fake, right? It's a novel. It doesn't really happen, and there are, as we'll go along, we'll see there are certain clues and ideas that are contained within the novel that are given to us that are designed to get us to think about this fact as well. All right? Okay. Now, I want to return to the point that I opened with and look at some examples, some further examples of how McEwan is looking at this question of perspective, right? And it's something that obviously, we can see as I began talking about how the different chapters have different perspectives, right? So too, particularly from chapter 3 onwards, we see characters thinking about the nature of perspective and how it changes the way in which they think. So the first couple of examples are actually from chapter 3. This is from page 19. Right? And this example is from some of those long meditations that Bryony has about the nature of perspective, right? And she starts to think, well, what if I am not the only one that has a perspective on the world? What if there are other people who have their own way of looking at the world and that they have their own way of seeing things? All right, so let me read it. Was everyone else really as alive as she was? That is Bryony. For example, did her sister really matter to herself? Was she as valuable to herself as Bryony was? Was being Cecilia just as vivid an affair as being Bryony? Did her sister also have a real self concealed behind a breaking wave, and did she spend time thinking about it with a finger held up to her face? Did everybody, including her father, Betty, Hardman? If the answer was yes, then the world, the social world, was unbearably complicated, with 2 billion voices and everyone's thoughts striving in equal importance, and everyone's claim on life as intense, and everyone thinking they were unique when no one was. One could drown in irrelevance. But if the answer was no, then Bryony was surrounded by machines, intelligent and pleasant enough on the outside, but lacking the bright and private inside feeling she had. This was sinister and lonely as well as unlikely, for though it offended her sense of order, she knew it was overwhelmingly probable that everyone else had thoughts like hers. She knew this, but only in a rather arid way. She didn't really feel it. All right. So we've talked previously about Bryony's selfishness, which stems from her her childish immaturity, right? It's not an unusual thing for people at this age to have these sorts of feelings, right? To feel that they are the center of the universe, right? So when we start to grow up, we start to realize that there are more perspectives than just ours out there, right? There's more to life than just what we feel and what we think, right? And the more that we mature, the more we start to realize these kinds of ideas, the more we start to be able to empathize with people, even if we haven't had the same experiences as them, right? Although, of course, it always helps to start to think about, if someone has been seriously ill, we say, oh, well, I've never been seriously ill. But as an adult, I can empathize with that. I can think, oh, yeah, I should think about it. I should care about you, right? Or whatever the situation is, we start to be able to see ourselves from the perspective of others, right? Whereas we've talked about how the childish perspective is reflected previously we talked about how it's reflected, for example, in the way Bryony tells her stories, right? Where previously her stories had always been just main character, Bryony, no one else really matters in the story. You just have sort of like machines that fill out the rest of the story. Now she's actually thinking about herself. And she thinks, well, this scene by the fountain gives me an idea for perspective. I can think about how I could write this story from the observer's perspective, from Robbie's perspective, from Cecilia's perspective. Wow, look at that. There's all these new possibilities, these new ways of seeing things and seeing the world. Okay. All right. This next quote is also from a similar part of the text, from page 21. Again, where she's thinking further about this question of perspective and how she is not the only one with this way of seeing the world. Bryony leaned back against a wall and stared unseeingly down the nursery's length. It was a temptation for her to be magical and dramatic and to regard what she had witnessed, this is the fountain scene, as a tableau mounted for her alone. Right? Tableau is when you have people create a living scene from like a painting. Right? And remember, this actually happens when Robbie and Cecilia both grab the vase. Right? When they grab it, right, the narrator tells us they freeze for a moment, almost like they're in a painting, right? Almost as if they're going to be put on a vase themselves. Okay? As a tableau mounted for her alone, a special moral for her wrapped in a mystery. But she knew very well that if she had not stood when she did, the scene would still have happened, for it was not about her at all. Only chance had brought her to the window. This was not a fairy tale. This was the real, the adult world in which frogs did not address princesses, and the only messages were the ones that people sent. It was also a temptation to run to Cecilia's room and demand an explanation. Right? So here we really see, again, Bryony emerging into that adult world, right? And it being marked by her new appreciation for this idea of perspective. Other people have feelings too. Other people have a way of seeing the world that's different from mine. Other people feel that they are important, right? Now, these ideas, McEwen is drawing upon a long history of philosophy that's thought about these kinds of things. Right? Very famously, just quickly, the French philosopher René Descartes, for example, right, famous for his ideas, his phrase, "I think, therefore I am." Right, you might have heard that before. Right, Descartes decided that only human beings actually were alive. He decided, right? He decided that's because human beings, because of his religious beliefs, have souls. So he argued that animals don't have souls, right? They're just complicated biological machines, was his argument, right? So this, of course, led to all sorts of rather nasty, cruel things being done in the name of, of science to animals, right? So, oh, they're just machines. Don't worry, the dog crying out in pain. Oh, it's just a program, right? Doesn't matter. Don't listen to it. So these kinds of ideas are not new to Bryony. They're not new to McEwen. They're things that he's drawing from the history of philosophy and the history of Western thought. Okay, so remember when I showed you this painting from earlier when we talked about the influence of Richardson and of Pamela upon those early parts of the novel. Remember I pointed out this scene in the summer house between Mr. B and Pamela, but also the way in which the painter gives this extra hidden observer, right? And this is the same function that Bryony imagines herself having in this narrative, right? Is that, Robbie and Cecilia are down there by the fountain. They're acting out their scene. She can't hear what's happening. She doesn't know what's actually being said, and she doesn't really understand what is being exchanged or what's happening between Robbie and Cecilia. But nonetheless, she's able to see everything that's going on and provide her own, as we see, quite wrong perspective on those things. Now, I'll come back to with a couple more examples of perspective in a moment. But I want to also connect this with the question of intention and innocence. Remember, we saw that part of the issue of Bryony's being a child, or is she an adult, right, lies in the fact that with adults, we tend to say that they have responsibility for their actions. They have moral responsibility, right? Whereas children, because of their age and because of their immaturity, we tend to remove them from having as much moral responsibility. That's why if you look at the law in pretty much any country, right, children are exempt from harsh punishments, from jail and other things like that, if they commit a crime, right? So, if a 7-year-old shoots someone, it's not the same thing as what happens to someone who is 30 years old and shoots someone, right? The adult is given the assumption of a moral responsibility that the 7-year-old, the child, is not, right? So that's why Bryony, being on this threshold between childhood and adulthood, is so interesting, is that we're sort of wondering, well, how much responsibility does she have? How much of an adult is she really? And how much of a child is she still? Okay. And Bryony herself raises this question about her own will, about her own ability to command her life. Right? This is a scene in chapter 3 where she's thinking about her finger, right? And she is saying, well, am I doing this? Right? Is that me? Right? But isn't there possibly something else that happens there? Like, think of when you go to the doctor and like the doctor gets one of those little rubber hammers and makes your knee bounce. Is that you? Right? Doing the reflex? Because it's not will. Right? You don't think, all right, now I'll make my knee jump or my leg jump. Right? But it is part of you. Right? It's still your leg. So, the quote says, she raised one hand and flexed its fingers and wondered, as she had sometimes before, how this thing, this machine for gripping, this fleshy spider on the end of her arm, came to be hers entirely at her command. Or did it have some little life of its own? She bent her finger and straightened it. The mystery was in the instant before it moved, the dividing moment between not moving and moving, when her intention took effect. It was like a wave breaking. If she could only find herself at the crest, she thought she might find the secret of herself, that part of her that was really in charge. All right? So together with the question of perspective, at the same time, McEwen also gets Bryony to think about this linked question of responsibility, right? How much responsibility does she have for her actions when she has intentions? How much is she responsible for those things, or as a child, is she innocent? Those are things to weigh up as we see what happens in the story. All right, so I'm going to skip that one. Oh no, actually, this is another good example from our reading today. Bryony, we see, takes a different tack, a different strategy. Right? This is right towards the end of chapter 7, right at the end of chapter 7. So on page 41. And remember, Bryony in that chapter had been all angry at herself, and she'd been slashing the nettles and, you know, getting all mad at herself and saying, I'm never going to write plays again. And then after all that anger, after all that energy, she's tired and she decides, fine, right? My problem has been that I've been following my imagination, following all these fantasies. Fine, I'm going to stop doing that. I'm just going to stand here until something real intervenes, right? I'm going to stand here until something happens to me, right? So here she says, this was the challenge she was putting into existence. She would not stir, not for dinner, not even for her mother calling her in. She would simply wait on the bridge, calm and obstinate, until events, real events, not her own fantasies, right? So she's not going to make up, you know, a prince rides along and carries her away, right? She's not going to write that, you know, an evil ogre attacks her and she has to fight it. None of those fantasies, right? She's just going to wait till something real comes along. So not her own fantasies rose to her challenge and dispelled her insignificance. Right? So at this point, right, which we'll see is quite a crucial turning point in the novel, although we don't quite yet know why, right, is important because it establishes, well, how innocent is Bryony? Well, in this case, she's saying, well, I'll let whatever happens, happens, right? If nothing happens, I'll just keep standing here. But if someone comes along and puts me into their story, puts me into their narrative, makes something happen in the real world, I'll do that, right? And so, of course, we see in the next chapter that Robbie sees her standing there, and he says, hey, Bryony, you deliver this letter for me, right? Is it Bryony's fault that she's standing there? Not really, is it, right? Just she decides, fine, right? I'll let fate decide. I'll let whatever happens, happens. So in this case, she deliberately, as an experiment, gives up her control that we've seen is so important to her, and she decides to let whatever happens, happens. I will be innocent, right? Not my fault if Robbie comes along and gives me a letter. Just what happened, right? So she gives up her control. Okay. So here are a couple of other examples of the importance of perspective. In particular, they're often quite subtle in the novel, and they are these moments of contrast that McEwen gives to us where we see characters interpret things in a way that is completely wrong. Right? It's rational, it's logical, you can see why they would come to these conclusions, but upon the larger evidence, we know that they're actually not true, well, not correct. Right? So the first one I've picked out here is that on page 15, back in chapter 2, we see that Cecilia, it's in the top paragraph there. Cecilia is kind of mad at Robbie. Right? Top paragraph. Cecilia is mad at Robbie. And she's mad at Robbie, she thinks, because she says, oh, he's always trying to embarrass me. Always doing weird things, doing strange things to try to embarrass me. Right? And she says, oh, here's an example, right? Says, everything he did was designed to distance her, like 5 lines from the top. Everything he did was designed to distance her. He was play acting the cleaning lady's son to the big house on errand. Right? And right before this, the incident that triggers these feelings says, Polly was on all fours, Polly's the maid, washing the tiles in the entrance hall. Robbie made a big show of removing his boots, which weren't dirty at all, and then, as an afterthought, took his socks off as well, and tiptoed with comic exaggeration across the wet floor. Right? So he comes in, takes off his shoes, takes off his socks, and she thinks that he's doing this to, like, say, oh, look at me, I'm just the poor, caretaker's son. Oh, yeah, I wouldn't want to step on your clean floor, right? This is her interpretation, right? She says, oh, he's just doing that to annoy me. He's just trying to show that, I'm the rich daughter and he's the poor caretaker's son. Oh, poor him. Right? So that's the initial interpretation we get of Robbie taking off his socks when he comes into the Tallis house. However, on page 44, we get to see Robbie's actual reason for doing this. Right? In the second paragraph there. From among the landscape books, he took the volume on Versailles he had borrowed from the Tallis Library. That was the day he first noticed his awkwardness in her presence. Kneeling to remove his work shoes by the front door, he had become aware of the state of his socks, holed at toe and heel, and for all he knew, odorous, and on impulse had removed them. What an idiot he had then felt, padding behind her across the hall and entering the library barefoot. His only thought was to leave as soon as he could. Right? So, first of all, the first scene, the first perspective that's given on this incident is that Cecilia thinks, he's mocking me. Like, he's making fun of me. He's trying to make me think about the class difference between us. And he's just he's provoking me, right? He knows what he's doing. He's trying to get to me. And then we see Robbie's perspective. His perspective was like, oh, I think I have a crush on this girl. Oh, I hope she doesn't see my ugly socks with holes in them and that stink. Oh, I'm going to take them off. Right? And he's terribly embarrassed. Right? So there are lots of little moments like this, small moments in the story that are clues to us about the way in which perspective is important, right? That we see that there are these two moments, the same little story of taking off the socks and creeping into the house. Not a big moment in the story, just something very small. But in each case, they are told in two different ways. We get two different perspectives, and we see that there is a big misunderstanding that comes about between Cecilia and Robbie as a result of that very small incident. Right? Of course, it's a part of a larger pattern that has developed between them, but it's one incident amongst those things. All right, another example from source on page 37, where we have Emily. We said chapter 6 is devoted to her thinking about what's happening in her house, right? And she's listening to all of the sounds, and she thinks, she almost sort of thinks, I'm like godlike. I can hear everything, and I know everything that's going on. I'm in charge of this house, right? Is how she seems to think about it. And as she's listening, she starts to hear the noises from the nursery, right, which are Paul Marshall interacting with the Quincy children. Right? Now, we know from the end of our reading last time, to whom is he talking mostly? To Lola, right? And we saw that he is flirting with her, and she is flirting back very strongly. Right? And does Mrs. Tallis think this? Does Emily think this? No. Right? We see instead she thinks, oh, that nice that nice Paul Marshall, he's going in there and he's entertaining those twins, those poor boys, right? They don't have anything to do, and their family is falling apart. He's probably going in there and chatting to them and entertaining them, and he's probably ignoring poor young Lola, right? So her perspective, she doesn't see what's actually going on. She just makes this assumption based on some of the noises that she hears in the house, and it turns out to be quite wrong, doesn't it? Right? We know that there is something else that's going on between Paul Marshall and Lola, and it doesn't involve Paul Marshall being just nice to the twins. Right? So, again, perspective changes the way in which these two different scenes, how we interpret them. The scene with Paul Marshall and the Quincy children and him giving them the chocolate and flirting with Lola and her flirting back, right? And then this scene, right? This little scene where Emily hears the noises through the house, and she comes up with this interpretation. Paul Marshall, oh, he's being a kind man. He's entertaining the twins. He's taking care of them. Okay. So, as I've already emphasized with the switching of the perspective in the chapters how important perspective is to this novel. But watch out for these little moments as well, right? These little moments in the text where scenes that we've come across earlier contradict each other, contradict what happened before, right? And these are designed, because nothing big particularly has happened in our novel so far, right? There haven't been huge dramatic events. The most dramatic thing that's happened is the scene by the fountain, but there are more dramatic events to come, as some of you already know. But these chapters are there to set up, as it were, clues for us how to read this novel, right? How to read and interpret what's going to come later. We can already see that the perspective from which something is told leads us to interpret it in a particular way. Who is telling the story? What are their motivations? What did they actually see? Did someone else see something different? Right? And has there been any kind of misunderstanding in the process? Right? All of these contribute not only to everyday human interactions that we see, right? But also to the big things, the big events that drive what happens in the novel, right? So always be very careful as you're reading this. I mean, you'll see there are many other small examples like this. There's, for example, a scene coming up in which the twins try to throw a wheelbarrow into the swimming pool, right? And again, that scene, just like the scene with the socks, is told from two different perspectives, right? Two different ways of interpreting what that event is. One sympathetic to the twins, one not sympathetic to the twins, right? So we have to be very careful when we're reading this novel. Perspective. Whose view are we getting to see? Whose perspective is it? What kind of bias is there being presented in the course of the narrative? All right. So let's turn now to our homework sheets, prep sheets, and let's see what are some of the important parts that you picked out. Right? I've spoken a bit about the chapters that we read today, but not in great detail. So I'd like to hear some of the ideas that you have picked out. Nadia, why don't you begin today? What did you pick out from the text? So his feelings are expressed as being explicitly sexual, right? And remember, part of what you may not be getting about this part of the story is that, of course, for us today, with the way in which movies and books and so on have gone, is that it's quite common for us to see violence and sex and other more difficult taboo subjects addressed in a very direct kind of way, even though this is not exactly pornographic kind of stuff, but it is addressed fairly directly by McEwan. But in the history of the British novel, that hasn't always been the case, right? That authors either deliberately, for the sake of their reputation or for the sake of their sales, did not talk about sexuality and those sorts of things directly. But also, we also will see there's Robbie is implicitly compared to a character by D.H. Lawrence. In D.H. Lawrence, some of his work was banned, right, for many years as being obscene, for having explicit sex scenes in it, and for dealing explicitly with questions of sexuality. Now, by today's standards, if you read a novel like Lady Chatterley's Lover, it's nothing, right? It seems very tame by today's standards, especially because Lawrence's way of writing is very poetic, and the way in which he writes about sex is not sort of like pornographic. However, remember, the story is set in 1935, right? And so the attitudes towards sexuality are a bit different, right? And so this is reflected as well in the way in which Robbie is thinking about his feelings for Cecilia, right? Is that he's thinking of them in a way that is meant to be true to his time period, right? And his position at how people would have thought in his situation in 1935, right? So, yes, he sits there and he analyzes these things. He thinks about his feelings. And what time of day is it? When is this happening? Beginning of chapter 8, first line? Early evening, right? Now, how much time has passed so far in the novel? We're up to chapter 8. How many months? How many years? No, it's all been one day, right? All been one day. So this is also a device that is borrowed particularly from modernist literature, right? So if you read a work like James Joyce's Ulysses, great big novel, all one day. All the action happens on one day. If you read Virginia Woolf's, one of her most famous novels, Mrs. Dalloway, not as long as Ulysses, relatively short, but again, all on one day, right? And there is this sort of attempt by those earlier modernist writers to sort of claim that you could use one day in the life of someone to provide a window into their whole life, right? You could see everything about them in one day. Now, atonement doesn't just take place in one day, but this stretching out of this first day is deliberately a nod back to some of those earlier writers, I think particularly to Virginia Woolf, who is a strong influence upon this novel. All right. Yes, good. So, yes, this is a common device, as we've talked about from the very beginning, of authors, is that they very often use the surroundings, right, to reflect the emotions of the characters, right? So we see that Robbie, you see his room is kind of a mess, he's kind of in disarray, and this reflects his mindset, right? He's confused, right? He's not sure what he feels, and he's in the process of thinking through what he's feeling for Cecilia, right? At first he's just confused, like, what the hell happened at this fountain? And then gradually as he goes along, he starts to realize, as he sits in his room, takes a bath, right? These allow him to start thinking through his feelings and his thoughts. Okay. Now remember, we've talked previously about how there are sometimes very much stronger symbols as well that are used, like the seasons, right? Remember, what time of year is this in the novel? It is summertime, right? That's why they've finished school, and we also see that as we go along, the cooks later on are asked to make this big hot meal, and they're like, oh, no one wants to eat a very big hot meal for a summer night. Okay, so it's summertime. What time of day is Robbie doing this? In the evening time, right? So again, just similarly to the seasons, the times of day tend to also be used symbolically as well, right? That this is sort of a twilight time for reflection and thinking. Okay, yes, good. So that's entirely possible, although the description of the temple is pretty scary. So is Bryony that scary to you as a character? Even at 13? Well, I guess we'll see as we go along if that's true. But remember that we're told there's all sorts of things about it that, originally, like this temple had been sort of, as we saw in the picture, decorative. It had been there for the sake of just, being kind of fake. Is how it's described. But now it's kind of scary and gothic, right? And like all of the, at the top of 39 there, the domed roof had been removed. The stone floor was covered in leaves and leaf mold. There are bird droppings and animal droppings all over the place. The window panes are gone from when Leon and his friends smashed them when they were little kids. All right? So this has gone from being that, if we go back to the picture, right? This is meant to be like a beautiful, idealistic, wonderful place, right? This is a place where, you have your picnics and romantic outings and family gatherings. Oh, this is a nice, relaxing place. So now it's like this, dirty, scary, gothic sort of place. It's, there's animals and birds have left their droppings there. The windows have all been smashed. The roof has fallen in. Oh, right? So we could compare it to Bryony, but it paints a very nasty picture of her character. Yeah. Okay. Yes. So this is a long-standing sort of theme in a lot of stories, isn't it? Is that there's the beautiful time before, right? So think of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Oh, everything was wonderful. We have fruit to eat and animals to play with and all sorts of stuff. And then afterwards, oh, it's all terrible. There's death and disease and everything comes into the world, right? And there's something sort of similar about that, isn't there? There's the childhood ideal of the temple, and then by the time that Bryony has come along, the windows are smashed. It's all dirty. It's all nasty, and so on. Just to come back to the scene with the nettles. What is Bryony thinking to herself when she's hitting the nettles? What is she comparing herself to? Where is she?
It says the playwriting itself became a nettle. Maybe she's hating the play.
She is hating the play, but she actually imagines herself at an event.
Olympics?
The Olympics. And she imagines that slashing nettles has been turned into an Olympic event. And she's like, I'm going to win the gold medal for smashing nettles. Right? Now, a particular reference here to what Olympics is coming up?
Berlin.
The Berlin Olympics. Remember, this is 1935, 1936 were the Berlin Olympics. What are they famous for? Anyone know? Berlin Olympics? Berlin is in what country? Germany. And in 1936, who was the ruler of Germany? Adolf Hitler, right? So it was a very controversial Olympics that particular year, right? Because, Hitler sort of used the Olympic Games to bolster his international image, and also there were protests, particularly by some American black athletes, right, who were discriminated against because, of course, Hitler had a racist regime, right? So famously, Jesse Owens won the 100 meters in that year, and was seen as almost a sign of a protest against the Nazi regime for their treatment of other people. So, yeah, this is even though this is almost comic, like she's imagining her, like there's no Olympic sport where you can win a gold medal for smashing nettles, right? But she is childishly imagining this. Bryony, tell us, coming in first. I'm going to win the gold medal. Yeah, she's won, right? And that is a childish game, right? Is how she's thinking of it. And at the same time, she's saying, take that childhood, take that, get rid of you. So just like we saw previously, there is a kind of inbuilt contradiction or inbuilt paradox into the way in which she's thinking. Just like we saw there was the contradiction within the wildflowers. Is it natural or is it artificial, right? Is this act of Bryony becoming, like she decides after smashing the nettles, remember, after she's tired, after she's hungry, she doesn't want to do it anymore, she decides, all right, fine, I'm out of energy, I'm going to be an adult now, I'm going to stand here, I'm not going to move until something comes along and is real. Is that an adult way of behaving as well? It's not, is it? Right? So both of these things that she does, right? Both of these things that she considers in her own mind to be her movement into adulthood, right? Slashing the nettles, where she counts for 13 years, right? Each slash is going to be taking away 1 year of like her childhood till she is old enough to not slash them anymore. And then this decision afterwards, right, fine, I'm going to stand here, is also very childish. Right? So even though these things that she thinks in her own mind are symbols of her moving beyond her childhood, of saying, all right, I'm an adult now, are actually indicators to us that she's still very immature, right? That she's still behaving like a child. And not surprising. I mean, it's like we've said, there hasn't even been a day passed since the beginning when she was going to put on the Trials of Arabella. So it's not like she's had months and months to mature. She's still the same girl that we saw from the morning. Well, sometimes you can create order, but sometimes life, as we see, intervenes. You can't control everything in the world. Remember, that's the lesson that Bryony learns, right, is with her play. She can control some things, she can try and manipulate some things, but not everything, right? Not everything can be controlled and manipulated. And that's just like to have that fantasy of controlling everything in the world, right, is very childish and immature. Yes, good. Yes, and we see that like her attack on the nettles is described as not just, it's described as being spiteful, right, mean, right. Have the nettles actually done anything? Nettles can sting you, right? They can hurt. But have the nettles actually done anything to Bryony? Have they actually stung her? No, they haven't, right? So we can see that this spitefulness is this attack on something that could sting her, that could cause her pain, but actually has not. And yes, we already know that she has she's misinterpreted the fountain scene in which she's recast Robbie as being some sort of villain in that scene, right? Remember we talked about that last time, about the way in which she thinks, oh, my sister can't have done this on her own, right? Robbie must have forced her to take off her clothes and get into the fountain, right? And this is the way in which she reinterprets that scene, that fountain scene, right? So yes, we can see that if those two things clash together, right, there could be problems. Yes, good. Right? Now, in thinking through his feelings, he talks about some like other authors and thinkers. Remember, we talked from the very beginning about the importance of references from other texts. Who are some of the main thinkers that he uses to think through his feelings? There's some poets, right? Right. So he mentions his collection of some of his like precious manuscripts, because some of them are expensive. Like he has a 3rd edition Jane Austen and so on. Right. So he has his literature. There's someone else who's mentioned. Who's that? A few times. Yeah, Sigmund Freud is how you say his name, right? And Sigmund Freud is one of the founders of psychoanalysis, right? Which is a kind of talking therapy in which you talk through your problems and try to identify what is the root of the problem, right? Now, some of Freud's ideas have entered into everyday speech that we still use even now. And one of the most famous is known as the Freudian slip. What's a Freudian slip? Anyone know? No? Okay, well, Freudian slip is where you say something and you speak incorrectly, right? And the mistake that you make actually like reveals something about what you're really thinking, right? So you actually make a mistake in speaking, but at the same time, the mistake you make reveals something about what you actually think, okay? Now, this same thing happens in the form of the letter, right? Because remember, he writes the 2 letters. And one is a formal, normal kind of, love letter. The other is the rather more obscene letter. But he makes this Freudian slip. He makes this mistake, right? And what Freud says about these kinds of slips, these kinds of mistakes that we make, is that, in a way, at an unconscious level, they're not really mistakes, right? We kind of do them because we really want to say the truth. But our conscious mind, right, our social side of ourselves says, oh, we're not really supposed to say that. I'm not really supposed to tell someone how I think about them or what I think of this situation. And there's a sense in which Robbie's accidentally putting letter. It is an accident, but it also suggests, well, maybe at a deeper unconscious level, maybe he really did want to tell Cecilia exactly what he wanted to think, right? So we'll see the implications of that as we see what unfolds in the next few chapters. All right, so we're out of time. Thank you, guys. Please hand in your prep sheets as you go, and we'll come back to talk about the next little bit of the story next time.